snow slammed against the train station like fists, and 12-year-old Ashley stood there barefoot, shivering so hard her teeth clicked like stones. She was starving, freezing, invisible to every person who rushed past pretending not to see her. Then a black SUV pulled up, and a man in an expensive coat stepped out. He pointed directly at her and said 5 words that made the entire crowd gasp. "I want to buy her." Ashley tried to run, but his men were faster, grabbing her thin arms while people just stood there watching, doing nothing. Then he walked up close, looked her dead in the eyes, and said something even more shocking. "Take off those rags." Everyone assumed the worst. Everyone thought they knew what was happening. But what he did next, what he whispered to his driver before getting in that car, it wasn't what anyone expected, and it changed Ashley's life in ways that would shock the entire city. Because that man wasn't who people thought he was, and Ashley wasn't just some random homeless kid. There was a reason he chose her specifically out of hundreds of forgotten children. A reason that would reveal secrets powerful people had spent years trying to bury. And by the end of this story, you'll realize the biggest twist wasn't what he did to her. It was what she did to herself. If you want to know why a billionaire would buy a starving child in the middle of a snowstorm, and what shocking plan he had that would transform her into something no one saw coming, you need to watch until the very end, because this story will leave you speechless. Snow didn't fall that night. It attacked, whipping across the abandoned train station like a pack of wolves hunting for prey, clawing at anyone foolish enough to stand outside in the freezing darkness. Right in the middle of that brutal storm, a tiny 12-year-old girl stood barefoot on the cracked concrete platform, shivering so violently her teeth clicked together like rattling stones, and every breath she took felt like swallowing shards of ice. That girl was Ashley, and if you had seen her in that moment, you would have felt something twist deep in your chest, that uncomfortable ache that whispers this shouldn't be happening to a child. Not here, not like this, not ever. Her hair was stiff with frozen dirt, tangled and matted like she hadn't had a proper wash in weeks, and her coat was nothing more than a torn gray rag that someone had tossed at her earlier out of pity, offering no warmth, no protection, no dignity. The city didn't stop for her, though. People rushed past with their collars turned high and their eyes turned deliberately away. Because you've seen it before, haven't you? How the world convinces itself that someone else will help, that it's not their responsibility, that maybe she deserves it somehow. But no one did help. Not when Ashley tried warming her numb hands under the flickering station light that buzzed and sputtered like it might die at any second. Not when her stomach growled so loudly that an older woman walking by actually flinched and quickened her pace. Not even when the station guard yelled at her to move along, as if a starving child could simply walk away from hunger and cold and desperation. Just when the cold felt like it was crawling permanently into her bones, becoming part of her forever. A sleek black SUV rolled up silently through the snow, its headlights cutting through the storm like twin blades of judgment, and everything around Ashley seemed to freeze in a different way. Have you ever felt danger before it actually arrived? That creeping sense crawling up your spine like invisible fingers warning you to run? Ashley felt it now, sharp and immediate and terrifying. The back door of the SUV swung open with a soft click, and a tall man wearing an expensive charcoal-colored coat stepped out onto the snow-covered platform, moving with the kind of calm confidence that said he didn't rush for anyone or anything, didn't feel bothered by the storm or the cold or the stares of frightened strangers. He didn't even look cold, standing there like the weather itself bent to his will, and he scanned the entire station slowly, methodically, his sharp eyes moving across faces and shadows until they finally landed directly on Ashley, pinning her in place like a butterfly under glass. Ashley's throat went dry, her heart suddenly pounding so hard against her ribs she thought it might crack right through her chest, and for one terrible second she couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The man raised one gloved hand and pointed straight at her with the kind of certainty that made her knees weak. And he said just one word, sharp and final and absolutely terrifying. "You." People around the station turned to look now, their curiosity overcoming their desire to stay invisible. And some actually stepped back, sensing something dark was about to happen, something they didn't want to be part of or witness. Ashley stood frozen in place, trembling not just from cold anymore, but from pure, raw fear that flooded every inch of her small body. Then the man added something that made an elderly couple nearby gasp out loud, made a young mother grab her child's hand and hurry away, made Ashley's knees nearly buckle beneath her. He turned to the two large men standing behind him like silent guards and said in a voice cold enough to match the storm, "Bring the girl. I'm buying her." Buying her? The words echoed in Ashley's head like stones dropping one by one into a bottomless well, each one sinking deeper. Bought, owned, taken, sold, gone. Most people don't know this, but moments like these create exactly two kinds of reactions in children. Some freeze completely, their minds shutting down to protect them from trauma, while others panic and try desperately to escape even when there's nowhere safe to run. Ashley tried to run, her survival instincts screaming at her move, but the snow was too deep and her legs were too weak from hunger and her bare feet slipped on the ice, making her stumble forward helplessly. The men moved fast, faster than she could ever hope to be, and one of them grabbed her thin wrist with fingers like iron bands while another pulled the ragged coat off her trembling shoulders, as if checking her for marks or scars or value. "Let me go," Ashley cried out, her voice cracking with desperation and terror, echoing across the platform where dozens of people pretended not to hear. "Please, I didn't do anything wrong. I swear I didn't. Please just let me go." But the wealthy stranger didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't show even a flicker of emotion on his cold, handsome face. He simply stepped closer, his expensive shoes crunching on the snow, and he lowered his head until his eyes were level with hers. And with a voice so calm it chilled the blood of everyone watching, he said 5 words that would change everything. "Take off those rags. She won't need them where she's going." People murmured nervously. A few lifted their phones to record what was happening, but then quickly lowered them again, too afraid to interfere with someone who clearly held dangerous power. Ashley stood there, trembling violently, the freezing air biting at her exposed skin, tears freezing on her cheeks before they could fall, and she watched helplessly as the man turned and began walking back toward the expensive SUV with the confidence of someone who always got exactly what he wanted. But what he did next, what he whispered to his driver in a voice barely audible over the howling wind, would become the first twist in a story that no one in that station would ever forget, a mystery that would haunt them for years. Before continue this story, tell us where in the world you're watching from and what time it is right now. Someone near you might be watching too. And don't forget to subscribe to support and appreciate the work we do on this channel. Before he climbed into the vehicle, before the door closed and sealed Ashley's fate, he leaned close to his driver and said something that made the man's eyes widen in shock. "Keep her alive and safe. She's the key to everything." The key to what, you're wondering? What could a freezing, homeless child possibly be the key to? What secret could she hold? What value could she have that a billionaire would buy her in the middle of a snowstorm? Even Ashley didn't know the answer, couldn't begin to imagine what he meant, but she was about to find out, and the truth would be more shocking than anyone could predict. Snow slapped against the warehouse windows like angry fists as Ashley's screams echoed through the cold metal building, her small voice swallowed by the sounds of clipboards slamming and boots stomping across concrete floors that smelled of rust and forgotten children. You ever seen a moment so unfair it made you want to reach through the screen and change everything? Made your chest tighten with rage at how cruel the world can be? This was one of those moments, and if you're watching this, you need to understand what was really happening here because it's darker than you think. Ashley wasn't being taken to some normal place. She was being dragged into District 11, a forgotten industrial zone on the edge of the city where abandoned children were processed like broken products that nobody wanted, sorted and evaluated, and discarded by a system that had stopped seeing them as human beings years ago. Inside the repurposed warehouse, fluorescent lights burned so bright they hurt Ashley's eyes after days of living in darkness. And workers in gray uniforms moved between rows of terrified children, shouting numbers and checking lists as if they were counting inventory instead of lives. Ashley wrapped her thin arms around herself desperately, trying to become invisible, trying not to cry, because she had learned that crying only made adults angrier, only made them see you as weak and worthless. But then something happened that made every person in that warehouse stop what they were doing and turn to stare. A man walked through the main doors, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop even though he brought no cold air with him, only power that radiated off him like heat from a furnace. The supervisors actually straightened their backs and adjusted their uniforms, suddenly nervous, suddenly aware they were being evaluated by someone who could destroy their careers with a single phone call, and people started whispering his name like it was a curse or a prayer. Mr. Cade Lawrenson, the industrial billionaire, the man who owned half the factories in 3 states. The quiet storm who never raised his voice but made grown men tremble. He didn't waste time looking around at the rows of children, didn't pretend to care about the system or the process or the rules. His dark eyes scanned the room with laser focus until they locked on Ashley like a missile finding its target, and she felt her breath catch in her throat because she knew, somehow she just knew, that he had come specifically for her, and only her. A clipboard worker rushed forward, stumbling over his own feet in his hurry to explain, his voice shaking as he said, "Sir, the girl is unassigned, no guardians on record, no support file, no family history. She's basically unclaimed property according to district regulations." Cade lifted one hand without even glancing at the man, and the entire warehouse fell into absolute silence. The kind of silence that happens when someone with real power decides to exercise it, when everyone realizes their words and opinions suddenly mean nothing. He took 2 slow, deliberate steps toward Ashley, melted snow dripping from his expensive coat onto the dirty concrete floor, and he crouched down to her eye level in a way that somehow made him seem even more intimidating. Not less, his voice low and steady when he finally spoke. "I'll take her," he said simply, and those 3 words detonated like a bomb in the quiet room, because no one ever chose children from District 11, especially not the difficult ones, definitely not the ones wearing ripped blankets and shaking from cold and trauma. But he didn't ask for her age or her medical records or her behavioral assessments or any of the things the system required. He simply stood up, removed his black leather gloves 1 finger at a time, and said the line that made every worker exchange nervous, confused glances with each other. "Take off those rags." Ashley flinched backward, her mind immediately jumping to the worst possible conclusion, and everyone watching assumed something dark. And terrible was about to happen, something they would pretend they didn't see, something they would lie about later. Subscribe now, because what he did next isn't what anyone expected, and if you miss it, you'll never understand the twist that changes this entire story. But the truth behind those 4 words, the real reason he said them, the shocking plan he had already put into motion before he even walked through those doors. What he did in the next 60 seconds would not only change Ashley's life forever, but would shake District 11 to its very foundation and expose secrets that powerful people had spent years trying to bury. A fist slammed against the cabin door with such brutal force that the entire frame shook and the metal hinges screamed in protest, jolting Ashley awake from the first real sleep she'd had in 3 days, her heart instantly exploding into panic mode like someone had dumped ice water directly into her veins. For one horrible, disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Only the fear, the cold, the overwhelming feeling of being hunted like an animal with nowhere left to hide, and her small body went rigid under the thick blanket the billionaire had given her. The cabin was almost completely dark except for the dying orange glow of the fireplace, its embers fading like hope itself, and Ashley's eyes darted around frantically, trying to understand what was happening, why her heart was threatening to burst through her ribcage. Another bang came, louder this time, sharper, too sharp to be just a hand-pounding wood. It sounded like metal striking metal, like someone was using a tool or a weapon, and the sound sent primal terror shooting through every nerve in Ashley's body. "He found me," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over her own ragged breathing, her mind immediately jumping to the worst conclusion. "Oh no, oh God, he found me." Have you ever felt that moment where time seems to stop and speed up at the same time, where your mind races ahead of your body screaming run, but your muscles won't cooperate because fear has frozen you solid? That's exactly what Ashley felt right then, trapped between instinct and paralysis, between survival and surrender. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming. The person outside that door wasn't the billionaire checking on her, and it definitely wasn't someone coming to help or rescue her from this isolated mountain cabin. It was him, the same vicious man who had dragged her to the auction square 2 nights before, the same man who had laughed when the crowd mocked her and placed bets on how long she would survive, the same man who had grabbed her wrist so hard it left purple bruises and sworn through tobacco-stained teeth, "You'll never get away from me, girl. You're mine. You hear me?" He had followed the billionaire's vehicle tracks through the snow, traced them all the way up this remote mountain road to this hidden cabin, and now he was here, and he was absolutely furious. "I saw your footprints in the snow, little rat." His voice hissed through the cracks in the door like poison seeping through, each word dripping with menace and rage. "Open up right now, or I'll break this door down and make you wish you'd never been born. You think some fancy rich man can keep you safe from me?" Ashley scrambled backward across the wooden floor, her bare feet sliding on the cold planks, her whole body shaking so violently she could barely control her movements, and she pressed her back against the far wall like she could somehow melt through it and disappear. Her desperate hands found the iron fire poker leaning against the stone hearth, and she grabbed it with both trembling hands, holding in front of her like a sword, even though she had absolutely no idea how to fight, had never thrown a punch or defended herself in her entire 12 years of life. But she wasn't going to let him drag her back to that nightmare, wasn't going to become his property again, wasn't going to give up without trying everything she could to survive. That's when she remembered something crucial, something the billionaire had told her just hours before he left the cabin to handle business in the city, his dark eyes boring into hers with unusual intensity. "If anyone comes looking for you, anyone at all, no matter what they say or promise, do not open that door under any circumstances. Do you understand me? I'll be back before morning." She hadn't believed him then, had thought maybe he was just trying to scare her into obedience, but now she prayed with everything in her soul that he kept that promise, that he would somehow know she was in danger. The banging grew even harder, more desperate and violent, and one of the door hinges actually screeched and bent slightly, sending splinters of wood flying across the cabin floor as snow began blowing in through the widening cracks. "Ashley," the man's voice snarled with terrifying certainty, somehow knowing her name even though she'd never told him. "If you make me break down this door, if you make me work for it, you won't like what happens next. I promise you that." Her knuckles turned white as she gripped the poker tighter, her arms shaking from fear and adrenaline. And you know that feeling where the whole world shrinks down to one impossible choice. Fight even though you'll probably lose, or give up and accept whatever horror comes next. That was Ashley's reality in this moment, and just when a man outside put his full shoulder into the door for one final, bone-shaking ram that would definitely break it open, just when Ashley closed her eyes and prepared for the worst, a shadow moved behind the frosted cabin window. A silhouette appeared, tall and completely still, just standing there in the darkness outside, watching everything unfold with an intensity that seemed to change the very air around the cabin. But whose shadow was it? And were they there to help or make everything infinitely worse? Comment below if you think Ashley survives this, because here's what nobody knew. Not Ashley clutching that poker, not the furious man about to break down the door, not even the billionaire himself. Someone else had been tracking both of them through the snow, following at a careful distance. Someone with their own dangerous agenda and the power to rewrite every rule. And what happened in the next breath would shock all three of them and change the course of this story in ways no one could predict. The snow had finally stopped falling, but somehow the cold felt even more vicious now, clinging to Ashley's skin like thousands of icy needles, stabbing through her torn clothes as the massive black SUV rolled to a complete stop at the edge of a forest clearing so remote it felt like the world had forgotten it existed. The man who had bought her, tall, silent, with eyes so dark and penetrating they seemed to see straight through her skin and her terrified soul, stepped out first, and the crunch of fresh snow under his polished leather boots was deafening in the eerie, unnatural stillness that surrounded them like a held breath. Ashley's wrists still bore the angry red marks from the chains they'd used at the warehouse, and she kept rubbing them unconsciously, trying to erase the memory of metal biting into her flesh. But Kate didn't make any move to acknowledge her pain or remove the marks or offer comfort of any kind. Instead, he simply gestured with one gloved hand toward a narrow, winding path that disappeared in the thick pine trees, their branches heavy with snow and shadows, and said in that low, commanding voice that made disobedience feel impossible, "You walk." There was no warmth in those two words, no pretense of kindness or explanation. Yet Ashley found herself obeying immediately, every muscle in her small body tense and aching, every step a struggle against the sharp pain in her bare feet that left tiny spots of blood in the pristine white snow behind her. Her mind raced with terrifying questions that had no answers. Why would someone with this much money and power pay for me specifically? What does he want? What's going to happen when we reach wherever we're going? And will I ever see another living person again? She could feel his eyes on her back constantly, unblinking and heavy like a physical weight pressing down on her shoulders, watching every stumble, every hesitation, every moment of weakness as she pushed through the freezing wilderness. The path finally opened up to reveal a small, solitary cabin standing alone in the clearing, smoke rising in a thin, steady wisp from its stone chimney, like a gray finger pointing at the dark sky. And the contrast between that warm smoke and the brutal, harsh wilderness surrounding it made Ashley's chest tighten with confused hope and dread. Cade moved ahead of her with confident strides, swinging the heavy wooden door open before Ashley could even process what was happening. And suddenly she was stepping into warmth so intense it almost hurt after hours in the freezing cold. Inside, a fire crackled and popped in a large stone hearth, casting flickering orange shadows that danced across rough wooden walls, and the cabin smelled like burning pine and something faintly medicinal that Ashley couldn't identify, but somehow found both alien and strangely comforting at the same time. He turned to face her directly then, really looking at her for the first time since the warehouse, and his voice cut through the silence with surgical precision. "Take off those rags." Ashley's heart stopped, literally felt like it stopped beating for 3 full seconds, and her mind immediately flooded with every horrible possibility, every nightmare scenario she'd heard whispered about in District 11 about what happened to girls who disappeared with powerful men. She froze completely, her body going rigid with terror, as she glanced down at the tattered, filthy clothes that had been her only shield, her only identity, her only possession in this cruel world that had taken everything else from her. Her hands trembled violently as she slowly, reluctantly obeyed, pulling off the ruined fabric as quickly as her shaking fingers would allow, her small body shivering uncontrollably in the cabin's warmth, her eyes wide and filled with equal parts fear and disbelief at what might come next. But then Cade did something that made her breath catch in complete shock. He stepped closer, and for one terrifying moment, Ashley thought her worst fears were coming true, but instead he held out a thick, soft blanket and a complete set of clean, warm clothes, real clothes that looked new and expensive and impossibly kind. She hesitated, every instinct screaming that this had to be a trick or a trap, that kindness from powerful men always came with strings attached. But the warmth that hit her skin as she wrapped herself in that blanket was so real, so genuine, so desperately needed that for the first time in months, she felt a tiny, fragile spark of something she'd almost forgotten existed. Safety, or at least the possibility of it. And then he did something even more shocking that made her chest tighten with confusion and desperate hope. He simply turned away from her, walked over to the fireplace, and began stoking the fire methodically, saying absolutely nothing more, just letting her process the reality that she was, strangely, impossibly, against all logic, no longer completely alone in this world. You felt Ashley's terror, and now you've witnessed her first spark of hope. You are invested in her transformation. To solidify that emotional investment, drop a comment that simply says, "I'm with Ashley," and then subscribe to be here for every single step of her journey from a victim to a powerful agent. What's coming next will make you understand why this billionaire is different from every villain you've ever seen. This was the first night Ashley realized with crystalline clarity that being bought didn't necessarily mean being destroyed, didn't automatically mean losing everything, and that the man who had paid money for her had intentions far stranger, more complex, and infinitely more dangerous than she could possibly understand yet. Intentions that would test every limit she had and transform her in ways that would shock everyone who thought they knew how this story would end. Ashley's fingers trembled as she touched the soft fabric of the blouse Cade had just placed in front of her, and the moment her skin made contact with it, an actual shock ran through her body, not from static electricity, but from the sudden, overwhelming realization that someone was treating her like she mattered, like she was worth more than garbage. She sat perched on the edge of a narrow wooden bench, the thick blanket still wrapped tightly around her small frame, even though the fire now blazed hot enough to make her cheeks flush, but the warmth did absolutely nothing to calm the violent storm raging inside her mind because nothing about this situation made sense. Nothing followed the rules she'd learned about how the world worked. Her heart still raced from the raw, primal fear of being bought like an object at that warehouse, treated like livestock being sorted and evaluated, yet underneath that terror of strange, dangerous curiosity was beginning to gnaw at her insides like a persistent itch she couldn't scratch. Who was this man really? Why had he singled her out when hundreds of other children stood in that warehouse? What did he see in her that made him willing to pay money when everyone else had turned away in disgust or pity? Cade entered the small room quietly, moving with that same deliberate, measured grace that made every gesture seem important, almost ritualistic, and he was carrying a small, ornate wooden box that looked ancient and valuable, the kind of thing Ashley had only seen through store windows in the wealthy part of the city. Her eyes widened instinctively, her body tensing with learned caution, because she had discovered quickly over the past few hours that every single object this man handled seemed to hold power, purpose, or secret meaning that she couldn't yet understand. He placed the box on the rough wooden table between them with careful precision, his movements so controlled they almost seemed choreographed, and without saying a single word, he opened it slowly, revealing stacks of pristine clothes folded with perfect geometric precision, completely untouched by the dirt and grime and desperation that had been Ashley's constant companions for as long as she could remember. "Wear these," he said, his voice calm, but carrying that unmistakable tone of command that made refusal feel impossible, that made her body want to obey before her brain even processed the words. Ashley hesitated, her hands hovering over the clothes like they might burn her if she touched them, and memories came flooding back unbidden. Memories of being mocked for her appearance, ignored when she begged for help, ridiculed by other children who had parents and homes and clean clothes, treated like she was contagious with poverty. These clothes in front of her were soft and expensive and alien to everything she knew about her own life, and the thought of actually putting them on felt like stepping into someone else's story, someone else's identity, someone she wasn't sure she had any right to become. But Cade's presence filled the small cabin like a physical force, silent yet absolutely undeniable, pressing down on her chest with the suffocating weight of expectation and unspoken consequences. She slowly reached out and took the first garment with shaking hands, a simple cream-color blouse that felt softer than anything she'd ever touched, softer than she even knew fabric could be. And as her fingers brushed across it properly, that electric shock of realization hit her again, harder this time. This wasn't just softness or comfort or warmth. This was power. This was a statement that someone actually saw her as more than invisible, more than worthless, more than the walking tragedy everyone else had decided she was. She dressed slowly, painfully aware of Cade's eyes watching her, even though he'd turned slightly away to give her privacy, and each piece of clothing seemed to fold her into a new, completely unfamiliar identity that felt both thrilling and terrifying. By the time she finished and caught her reflection, in the small, cracked mirror propped against the cabin wall, she barely recognized the girl staring back at her. This person looked cared for, looked valuable, looked like someone adults might actually listen to instead of dismissing immediately. Cade watched her silent transformation without expression, then finally spoke again, his words slicing through the tense air like a blade cutting silk. Your life will be different now, completely and permanently different, but remember this one truth above all others. Nothing in this world is free, nothing is given without expectations, and every privilege, every gift, every single second of comfort you experience from this moment forward comes with its cost, and you will learn that lesson quickly whether you're ready or not. Ashley's stomach tightened painfully, twisting into knots of anxiety and confusion. Because was this a warning about what he planned to do to her? Was this a lesson he was teaching? Or was this the beginning of something far more dangerous than she had the experience to understand? She didn't know, couldn't know, but one thing became absolutely clear in that moment as firelight flickered across his unreadable face. The world outside these cabin walls, the world of cold streets and hunger and people who ignored suffering, was nothing compared to the storm she was about to face, and she had absolutely no idea what this man's true intentions were or what he would eventually demand in return for saving her life. Ashley's eyes snapped open to piercing sunlight streaming through the tiny cabin window like a spotlight designed specifically to expose her vulnerability. And for the first time in months, she felt something that resembled hope tangled so tightly with fear that she couldn't tell where one emotion ended and the other began. The man who had bought her was already awake and standing by the wooden table with his hands folded behind his back in that military straight posture, as if he'd been waiting there for hours just watching her sleep, evaluating whether she was worthy of the strange opportunity he'd given her or if he'd made a terrible mistake. Without any warning or explanation, he stepped forward and handed her a folded piece of paper, and Ashley took it cautiously with trembling fingers, unfolding it like it might explode in her hands. It was a list written in sharp, precise handwriting that looked almost aggressive in its perfection, containing names she'd never heard before, addresses in parts of the city she'd never been allowed to enter, and cryptic instructions that made absolutely no sense to her 12-year-old mind. Her heart skipped a beat and then started racing double time, pounding against her ribs like it was trying to escape her chest. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice barely audible, cracking with confusion and the beginnings of panic, because this felt important in a way that terrified her. Kate didn't answer immediately, didn't rush to explain or comfort or ease her obvious distress. Instead, he stepped closer, his dark eyes scanning her face with such intensity it felt like he was reading every thought, every fear, every doubt that flickered across her expression. "This is your first test," he said finally, each word deliberate and weighted with meaning that Ashley couldn't fully grasp yet. "These people on this list are important, more important than you can possibly understand right now. Their attention, their trust, even their loyalty, they all matter in ways that will determine whether you survive or fail in this new world. You will learn how to gain it, to navigate it, to use it strategically, and mistakes will cost more than embarrassment or disappointment. They will cost you everything." Ashley's stomach turned violently, acid rising in her throat, because she had never been in a position of power or responsibility before, had never been trusted with anything more important than finding her next meal, and yet here she was holding a list that seemed to measure the entire weight of her worth as a human being. The fear of failure gripped her so tightly she could barely breathe, squeezing her lungs like invisible hands determined to suffocate her. But underneath that crushing fear, something else sparked to life. A strange, unfamiliar determination that felt both exhilarating and terrifying. She wasn't just surviving anymore, wasn't just trying to make it through another freezing night or find another scrap of food. She was being given the chance to learn how to maneuver through a world she had been locked out of for her entire miserable life. A world where people like her were supposed to remain invisible forever. Cade watched in complete silence as she studied the list, her fingers trembling so badly the paper shook and made soft, rustling sounds. And then, without another word of explanation or encouragement, he handed her a small leather-bound notebook and an expensive silver pen that felt heavy with importance in her small hand. "Record everything," he instructed in that commanding tone that made disobedience feel impossible. "Every observation, every strategy that works or fails, every mistake you make, and every success you achieve. This notebook will be your guide, your armor, and your weapon in a world designed to destroy people like you. So use it wisely or don't use it at all. Ashley nodded, barely breathing, her chest so tight with anxiety she thought she might pass out because the weight of that notebook in her hands felt heavier than the chains that had bound her wrists at. The warehouse, heavier than all the hunger and cold she'd endured in her short life. She realized then with crystalline clarity that she was being transformed, molded like clay in the hands of a sculptor, tested in ways that were both thrilling and absolutely terrifying, pushed towards something she couldn't yet see or understand. By the time night fell and darkness surrounded the cabin again, Ashley had spent hours mapping out the first steps of her new world with careful, deliberate precision, memorizing names and addresses and instructions until they were burned into her memory. She knew with bone-deep certainty that every decision she made from this moment forward, every action she took, every word she spoke would be scrutinized and measured and judged, and that every single slip or mistake could change the course of her entire life forever in ways she couldn't predict or control. And deep inside her chest, underneath all the fear and anxiety and doubt, she felt a shiver of genuine excitement that both thrilled and scared her. She was no longer just a girl in rags begging for scraps, no longer invisible or worthless or disposable. And the billionaire who had bought her was already pushing her towards something extraordinary and dangerous. Though she didn't yet understand what it would ultimately demand or what devastating price it might cost her soul. She is about to face a moral choice that would shatter most adults. This is the moment where we discover her true cost, or her true courage. If you believe her journey is worth telling and that she will choose integrity, show your support now. Hit the notification bell, subscribe, and comment courage to ensure you don't miss the final, most shocking act of her test. Ashley's boots crunched against the frozen snow with each painful step as she followed Cade through the narrow, twisting trail behind the cabin, and the forest loomed around them like a living entity, dark and endless, and filled with shadows that seemed to move with malicious intent. The wind cut through her new clothes like invisible knives, sharp and brutal despite the quality of the fabric, and fear twisted in her stomach like a living snake coiling tighter and tighter until she could barely breathe. But she kept her steps steady and measured because she knew with absolute certainty that showing weakness now would be a mistake she couldn't afford to make. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, to turn around and flee back to the cabin, or even back to the streets where at least she understood the rules and the dangers. But she also knew she couldn't run. Not yet. Not when Kate had invested so much into her, and not when she'd finally glimpsed the kind of power that lay waiting if she could just survive long enough to claim it. They stopped abruptly at the edge of a frozen pond, its surface covered with a thin layer of ice that looked deceptively fragile, almost translucent in the gray winter light, and Cade knelt beside it without explanation, his gloved hands scraping away the ice and snow with methodical precision. Ashley watched with her breath fogging in the freezing air, her heart hammering against her ribs as he revealed something buried beneath the frozen surface. An intricate wooden box, beautifully carved with symbols she didn't recognize, yet somehow ominous in its very presence, like it contained secrets that could destroy lives. "Retrieve it," Cade said, his tone completely neutral but carrying a weight that crushed any thought of hesitation or refusal. And Ashley understood instantly that this wasn't a request, but a command disguised as an instruction. Her fingers shook violently as she reached down into the icy water, the cold so intense it felt like her hand was being burned rather than frozen, and she grabbed the box with both hands, pulling it free from its hiding place with a gasp of pain and effort. Inside the box, she found papers covered in dense handwriting, small metallic tokens that looked ancient and valuable, and a single iron key that was surprisingly heavy for its size. And she realized immediately with a sinking feeling in her chest that this was no ordinary task. This was a test of courage, judgment, and composure under extreme pressure. The kind of test that could determine whether she lived or died in this new world. The wind howled through the trees like wolves hunting prey, as if warning her that failure here could mean something far worse than disappointment or punishment, and Ashley turned the key over in her trembling hand, feeling its weight, imagining all the doors it could open and all the terrible consequences that might follow if she misused it or made the wrong choice. Cade's eyes were fixed on her with that unblinking, unwavering intensity that made her feel completely exposed, like he could see every thought racing through her terrified mind. And in that penetrating gaze, she felt both crushing fear and the strangest spark of exhilaration she'd ever experienced, because she had never been watched like this before, never been evaluated with such precision, while simultaneously being encouraged to rise above her limitations. As they trudged back through the deep snow toward the cabin, Ashley's mind raced through possibilities and scenarios and questions that had no clear answers. What were these papers? Who did the tokens belong to? What lock did this key open? And why was Cade trusting her with something that clearly held enormous importance? The tasks ahead remained unclear, and the rules felt invisible and constantly shifting. But the stakes had never been higher or more real, and every misstep could unravel the fragile trust he had placed in her small, inexperienced hands. And yet with each step through the freezing wilderness, with each painful breath of frigid air that burned her lungs, Ashley felt something growing inside her chest, a sense of purpose she'd never known before, a new identity forming in the crucible of fear and opportunity, transforming her from a victim into something she couldn't yet name, but desperately wanted to become. That night, wrapped in the thick blanket beside the crackling fire, Ashley stared into the dancing flames and whispered to herself with fierce determination, "I will survive this. I will learn everything he teaches me. I will become strong enough to never be powerless again." Subscribe before the next chapter, because what Ashley discovers about that key will change everything you think you know about this story. And deep in her exhausted mind, one burning question kept repeating like a drumbeat. She would discover exactly why the man who bought her had chosen her specifically out of hundreds of forgotten children, and what shocking, dangerous plan he had been preparing long before he ever walked into that warehouse. A plan that would test every limit she possessed and transform her in ways that would leave everyone who knew her story absolutely stunned. Ashley woke to a sudden, chilling realization that made her entire body go rigid with terror. The cabin was silent in a way that felt completely unnatural and wrong, the kind of silence that happens right before something catastrophic breaks loose and destroys everything in its path. The fire had burned dangerously low, leaving shadows that stretched across the wooden walls like dark, grasping fingers reaching for her, and her body tightened instinctively as every nerve in her system screamed that something was different tonight, something was coming that would change everything. Cade stood by the window, staring into the forest with an intensity that made Ashley shiver despite the blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and without turning to look at her, without any warning or preparation, he spoke in that cutting voice that sliced through the cold air like a blade. "Tonight you face your first real challenge. Not a practice run or a simple test, but something that will determine not only your position in this world, but how everyone from this moment forward will see you and treat you and judge your worth." Ashley's stomach lurched violently, dropping like she'd been pushed off a cliff, because she had been tested before with small tasks and observations and lessons in awareness. But this felt completely different. This felt real and tangible and absolutely terrifying in a way that made her previous challenges seem like children's games. He handed her a small envelope, heavy with unknown weight and sealed with dark red wax that looked almost like dried blood, and her fingers trembled so badly she could barely break the seal without tearing the paper. Inside were instructions written in that same precise handwriting, but these words made her blood run cold. She was to go into the city alone, confront people who held real power and influence, intimidating figures who would dismiss or mock or potentially hurt a 12-year-old girl, and she had to secure information that was vital to Cade's interests without raising suspicion or making mistakes that could expose everything. She was 12 years old. She would be completely alone in a city that had already proven it didn't care if she lived or died. And now she had a mission that could either elevate her to a position of genuine power or destroy her so completely that even Cade wouldn't be able to save her. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat, choking her as she imagined the crowded streets, the towering buildings filled with adults who would look down on her literally and figuratively, the endless crowds of people who would dismiss her or ignore her or worse, and every terrifying possibility played out in her mind like a horror movie she couldn't stop watching. But underneath that overwhelming fear, something else was emerging from deep inside her chest. An almost electric determination that crackled through her veins like lightning, hot and fierce and unstoppable. Because she had survived the auction and the chains and the biting cold and the isolation, she had learned lessons of patience and observation and courage that most adults would never master. And now it was time to put everything she'd learned to the ultimate test. Cade watched her reaction with that measuring, analytical stare, studying every flicker of emotion that crossed her face. And then he finally said in a voice that left no room for negotiation or escape, "You leave at dawn when the city is just waking up and people are distracted and vulnerable. Fail at this task, and it will not be merely disappointing or embarrassing. It will be catastrophic for both of us. But succeed, and you will finally begin to understand the real power you hold and why I chose you specifically." Ashley swallowed hard, her throat dry as sand, feeling a thrill and a terror pulsing through her body in equal measure, two opposing forces that threatened to tear her apart from the inside. That night, she lay completely awake in the darkness, unable to sleep even for a moment, the envelope clutched tightly against her chest like a talisman or a curse. And for the first time since being bought, she realized with absolute clarity that this transaction had not been the end of her life or her freedom. It was actually the beginning of something far more intense, far more dangerous, and infinitely more shocking than she had ever imagined possible. And deep down in the most honest part of her soul, beneath all the fear and doubt and anxiety, Ashley knew that when morning came and she stepped out of this cabin to face the city alone, nothing in her world would ever be the same again. And the girl who returned, if she returned at all, would be fundamentally transformed in ways that would shock even her. Ashley's first steps into the city felt like plunging headfirst into a roaring storm that wanted to swallow her whole. And the streets were absolutely alive with noise and lights and constant movement that made her head spin and her heart race with overwhelming panic. Every single face that passed seemed to scrutinize her with suspicious eyes, judging her worth in microseconds and finding her lacking. And she clutched the envelope so tightly against her chest that her knuckles turned bone white and her fingers went numb from the pressure. She was only 12 years old, dressed in the fine clothes Cade had provided that should have made her blend in with the wealthy crowds. But still the world seemed immense and intimidating and utterly merciless, designed specifically to crush people like her who dared to think they could rise above their station. Her first encounter happened at a towering office building made of glass and steel that reflected the morning sun like a blinding weapon, and the brass nameplate on the polished door bore the title of Marcus Linton, Executive Vice President, words that meant power and danger in equal measure. Ashley took a deep breath that did nothing to calm her racing pulse, pushed open the heavy door with both hands because it was too massive for her small frame, and stepped into a lobby so pristine and expensive-looking that she felt like her very presence was contaminating it. The receptionist's eyes narrowed immediately at the sight of a child standing there trying desperately to project confidence that was far too forced and obvious, and the woman asked with barely concealed amusement in her professionally polite voice, "May I help you, sweetheart?" Ashley lifted her chin exactly the way Cade had taught her, drawing on every lesson about presence and poise and command that he'd drilled into her brain during those long nights at the cabin. And she said with surprising clarity, despite her shaking voice, "I have an urgent message for Mr. Linton that cannot wait or be delayed." The minutes that followed felt like hours as Ashley waited in that intimidating lobby, watching important-looking adults rush past her without a second glance. And then finally a tall man appeared from the elevator, stern and imposing and completely unimpressed by the small girl standing in his expensive lobby making demands. Ashley's stomach twisted into painful knots, but she remembered the specific instructions from the envelope that Cade had given her. Observe everything, adapt to whatever situation develops, persuade through a careful balance of truth and strategic omission. She spoke carefully to Mr. Linton, choosing every single word like she was defusing a bomb, balancing honesty with calculated deception, fear with manufactured authority, vulnerability with surprising steel, and by the time their tense conversation ended, the man had actually handed over confidential documents that Ashley didn't fully understand but knew instinctively were absolutely crucial to Cade's plans. Ashley's pulse raced with a mixture of pure exhilaration and bone-deep terror as she left that building, the documents hidden inside her coat, and the city suddenly felt different around her. She wasn't completely invisible anymore, wasn't just another forgotten child that people could ignore without consequence. Each step she took down those crowded sidewalks felt like a statement, a declaration that she could actually navigate this brutal world even at 12 years old, even without parents or protection or any of the advantages other children took for granted. But the thrill of her success was immediately tempered by a gnawing awareness that made her chest tighten with anxiety. Cade was definitely watching somehow, monitoring her progress through methods she couldn't see or understand. And every decision she made carried consequences that reached far beyond what her young mind could fully imagine or comprehend. By the time she returned to the cabin late that afternoon, exhausted but triumphant and buzzing with adrenaline, Ashley realized something that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Fear no longer ruled her entirely or controlled every decision she made, because she had faced the city's scorn and intimidation and outright disbelief and somehow survived, even thrived. But she also understood with brutal clarity the cruel truth that Cade had been trying to teach her all along. This victory was only the beginning of something much larger and more dangerous. The real challenges were still waiting ahead like predators and shadows, and the man who had bought her had plans that would push her far beyond simple courage into a world of shocking power, unexpected danger, and lessons that no child should ever have to learn. If you think Ashley's safe now, comment below, because you have no idea what's coming next. Her reflection in the cabin window that night showed a girl who had changed in fundamental ways, smaller and younger than everyone around her. Yes, but sharper and fiercer, and most importantly ready for whatever brutal test came next, even if it destroyed her in the process. Ashley didn't have time to rest or recover or even process what she'd accomplished in the city. The moment she walked through the cabin door, still catching her breath and trembling from adrenaline, Cade was already waiting with another folder in his hands, and its weight felt surprisingly heavy for something so thin when he handed it to her without a word of praise or acknowledgement. Her hands trembled as she opened it with shaking fingers, and inside were glossy photographs of elegantly dressed people, detailed typed notes about their backgrounds and connections, and information about a high-stakes charity gala taking place that very night in the heart of the city's wealthiest district. The instructions were brutally clear and terrifyingly simple. She would attend this gala as Cade's guest, observe everything with the sharp awareness he'd been training into her, and extract information that even the most seasoned adults would struggle to uncover without raising suspicion or creating enemies. Her heart raced so fast she thought it might actually burst as she processed what he was asking. A 12-year-old girl, sent into a room filled with powerful and intimidating adults who controlled entire industries, expected to act as if she belonged there naturally, while secretly gathering intelligence that could shift the balance of power. The thought alone would have terrified any other child into paralysis or tears or outright refusal. But Ashley had been systematically trained over the past weeks in patience and observation and subtle manipulation, and she drew a deep, steadying breath before straightening her posture and allowing herself the smallest spark of fierce determination. She would not fail, could not fail, because failure now meant losing everything she'd fought so hard to build and proving that Cade had made a mistake in choosing her. When they arrived at the gala several hours later, Ashley dressed in an expensive navy dress that made her look older and more sophisticated than her years. The sheer opulence of the venue hit her like a physical wave that threatened to knock her backward. Crystal chandeliers hung from impossibly high ceilings, reflecting and refracting light in every color of the spectrum, and the massive ballroom buzzed with influential figures laughing and drinking and exchanging power like currency, while a string quartet played haunting music in the corner. Ashley's small frame should have made her invisible in this crowd, should have relegated her to the status of a curious oddity that adults glanced at and then dismissed, but she had learned something crucial from Cade. Invisibility could be her greatest advantage if she wielded it correctly. She moved through the crowd quietly and deliberately, her eyes constantly scanning and recording, her ears tuned to catch every whispered conversation and subtle exchange, and she memorized every gesture, every meaningful glance, every carefully chosen word that revealed alliances forming or rivalries simmering beneath the surface of polite society. Suddenly a man approached her directly, one of the most influential figures in the entire room, according to the folder she'd studied, and his eyes narrowed with barely concealed suspicion as he sized her up like she was a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. "And who might you be, young lady?" he asked with sarcasm dripping from every syllable, clearly expecting her to stumble or retreat or prove herself unworthy of being in his presence. Ashley's pulse leapt into her throat and her stomach clenched with instant panic. But she recalled Cade's lessons with crystalline clarity. Stay calm under pressure, project confidence even when terrified, and ask questions that seem innocent but actually extract valuable information. She smiled faintly, meeting the man's intimidating gaze with more assurance than she actually felt burning in her chest, and asked a carefully crafted question that seemed like simple curiosity but was actually designed to make him reveal details about a business deal Cade needed to know about. The man's expression shifted subtly from amusement to surprise to something that almost resembled respect, and he answered her question more thoroughly than he should have, clearly underestimating how much a child could actually understand or remember or use against him later. By the time the gala ended and the crowds began filtering out into the cold night, Ashley had secured critical details and observations and connections that would impress even Cade, enough information to prove her worth beyond any doubt. She returned to the cabin that night absolutely exhausted but electrically exhilarated, her mind still racing with everything she'd seen and heard and accomplished, and she realized with shocking clarity that she was no longer simply a girl who had been bought like property. She was becoming an agent of real influence, someone capable of navigating a world that most adults couldn't even begin to comprehend. Subscribe now, because the next challenge will test whether Ashley can handle what happens when her new power attracts dangerous attention. And as she collapsed in a bed that night, one chilling thought kept her awake staring at the ceiling. Cade's plans were only growing bolder and more complex, and the next challenge he had prepared would test absolutely everything she had learned and possibly even her ability to survive. Ashley had never felt betrayal like this before, never experienced the kind of soul-crushing shock that makes your entire world tilt sideways and nothing feels solid or trustworthy anymore. And the moment began innocuously enough with a simple message delivered by an unfamiliar courier who appeared at the cabin door without warning. A sealed note slipped into her trembling hand, and signed and written in handwriting she didn't recognize, warning her that someone she had trusted during her missions in the city had been secretly feeding false information to rival interests who wanted to destroy everything Cade was building. Her stomach turned violently, acid rising in her throat as pure panic began flooding her system, because this wasn't just about failing a test or disappointing Cade anymore. This was about real danger, about exposure that could get both of them killed, about consequences she was still too young and inexperienced to fully comprehend, but old enough to fear with every fiber of her being. Cade stood silently behind the cabin doorframe, watching her reaction with those unreadable dark eyes, his expression giving away absolutely nothing, and he said in that maddeningly calm voice, "You must decide how to act, how to respond, how to fix this situation before it destroys us. The choices you make in the next few hours will shape everything that comes after." Ashley's hands shook so badly the note fluttered like a trapped bird as she processed the implications, and every lesson Cade had taught her about observation and patience and careful discretion suddenly felt like lifelines in a storm that was threatening to drown her completely. One wrong move could unravel weeks of dangerous progress and place her directly in harm's way, could expose her as a fraud and get her sent back to District 11 or worse. And the weight of that responsibility pressed down on her 12-year-old shoulders like a physical burden she could barely carry. She returned to the city immediately without eating or resting, moving through the familiar streets with a careful urgency she hadn't needed before. And the betrayal stung like fire in her chest, because she had actually started to trust people, had believed that maybe not everyone in this brutal world was out to destroy her. Every familiar face now carried potential suspicion in her racing mind. Every word spoken near her could be a lie or manipulation. Every gesture and glance had the potential to deceive or expose or harm, and Ashley felt her small body tighten with adrenaline that made her hyper-aware of everything around her. She confronted the person named in the anonymous note, a young aide who worked in one of the offices she'd visited, someone who had seemed harmless and even friendly during their brief interactions, someone she never would have suspected of betrayal. The confrontation was tense and electric, with eyes locked across a small cafe table and words measured with surgical precision, as Ashley balanced truth with subtle intimidation in a way that would have been impressive for an adult and was absolutely shocking coming from a child. By the end of their conversation, the aide had confessed quietly with tears in their eyes, finally realizing the depth of the consequences they'd triggered and the storm that Ashley had been specifically trained to summon when necessary. Returning to the cabin hours later, Ashley felt both exhilaration at having handled the crisis and complete exhaustion that made her bones ache, but underneath those surface emotions, something deeper and more disturbing had taken root. She realized with brutal clarity that Cade had not only bought her freedom from poverty and starvation, he had deliberately thrust her into a world where innocence and trust could no longer protect her from harm, where every lesson carried its own dark shadow, where survival demanded constant vigilance and the willingness to suspect everyone. As she lay awake that night, staring at the rough wooden ceiling, the weight of betrayal pressed down on her chest like a physical force, crushing her ribs, and her small hands clutched the blanket while her mind raced through strategies and contingencies and endless what-if scenarios. She had survived being sold once, had endured the freezing cold and the hunger and the isolation, had braved the intimidating city and faced down powerful adults. But now she understood the harshest truth that Cade had been preparing her for all along. In this world of hidden agendas and shifting loyalties, power demanded not just courage, but constant vigilance, ruthless cunning, and the ability to act decisively and without mercy when others would freeze or hesitate. Comment if you think Ashley made the right choice, because what happens next will make you question everything. Ashley's transformation was no longer some distant hypothetical possibility. It had already begun in ways she was only starting to recognize, and there was absolutely no turning back to the innocent girl she used to be. Ashley's pulse raced out of control as she stared at the envelope sitting on the wooden table like a coiled snake ready to strike, and her trembling fingers held it, as if it contained not just her future, but her very soul, her entire identity, everything she might become or lose forever. Kate had left it there with a single instruction that echoed in her mind like a death sentence. Make a choice, decide now, and live with the consequences, because there would be no second chances or opportunities to undo what she was about to do. Inside the envelope were two options laid out in precise detail, both impossible in their own devastating ways, each one carrying consequences she could barely imagine with her 12-year-old understanding of how the world actually worked. Her chest tightened painfully until she could barely draw breath, and she realized with shocking clarity that this was no longer about simple obedience or careful observation or proving she could follow instructions. This was about judgment, about responsibility, about choosing who she would become and what kind of person she was willing to be. One choice would allow her to gain immediate favor in the cutthroat business world, securing powerful allies who could protect her and elevate her status beyond anything a child from District 11 should ever dream of achieving, offering safety and comfort and the promise of genuine influence. The other choice would require her to expose a dangerous secret that could protect innocent people but would simultaneously endanger herself and the few allies she had begun to trust, forcing her to sacrifice her own security for something as abstract and fragile as doing what was right. Ashley's mind whirled with competing thoughts and fears and desires. Yet she felt the invisible weight of Cade's calculating gaze, even though he wasn't physically present, because he had placed her in this impossible crucible for a specific reason, testing not just her intelligence or her courage, but her fundamental integrity and whether she could be trusted with real power. The first decision called to her with seductive sweetness, offering the comfort of protection and the warmth of belonging and the intoxicating promise of influence, whispering that she deserved safety after everything she'd suffered and endured. But then the second decision clawed at her conscience with sharp talons, reminding her of who she had been before the cabin and the auction and the city, reminding her that she had once been invisible and dismissed and disregarded and treated like human garbage, and to betray the truth now would be like betraying that suffering girl she used to be, erasing her completely. Hours passed in agonizing slowness as Ashley weighed every possible consequence with the careful precision Cade had trained into her, her exhausted mind sharp despite the emotional toll, and she pictured the faces of people she had encountered during her missions, the risks she had already taken, the lessons she had survived through sheer determination. And then, with a trembling hand, but a heart that had finally found its resolve, she made her choice with decisive finality, sealing the envelope, and knowing that the path she had chosen would shock even the man who had bought her and trained her and pushed her toward this exact moment. When Cade returned to the cabin hours later, as darkness fell outside, Ashley handed him the sealed envelope without speaking, and his eyes narrowed into that unreadable expression as he studied her face for signs of doubt or weakness. For one long, suffocating moment, complete silence filled the cabin except for the crackling fire and Ashley's racing heartbeat pounding in her ears, and she held her breath waiting for judgment. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, Cade nodded once, and the faintest trace of something that might have been approval or respect or even pride brushed across his normally stone-cold features. Ashley's heart leapt in her chest, not from relief or celebration, but from the profound knowledge that she had just stepped fully and irrevocably into a world that demanded courage and cunning and a resolve that went far beyond her years or experience. The choice was made. The consequences were now inevitable and approaching like a freight train she couldn't stop. And Ashley knew with a mixture of bone-deep fear and electric exhilaration that nothing in her life would ever be simple or safe or innocent again. But she had proven something crucial to herself. She could make impossible decisions under crushing pressure and live with whatever followed. Subscribe because the fallout from this choice will change everything you think you know about where this story is headed. And deep in her exhausted soul, Ashley understood that this moment, this single choice, had transformed her from a girl trying to survive into someone capable of shaping her own destiny. Even if that destiny led her into darkness she couldn't yet see or understand. Ashley's eyes widened until they hurt as Cade led her to a hidden door behind the cabin that she had never noticed before. A door concealed so cleverly behind a bookshelf that she had walked past it dozens of times without realizing it existed. And when he pushed it open with a soft click, the musty smell of secrets and old paper rushed out like escaping ghosts. The room beyond was unlike anything Ashley had ever seen. Walls completely lined with bookshelves that stretched from floor to ceiling, each one crammed with documents and maps and objects that seemed to hold stories far older and infinitely darker than anything her young mind could begin to comprehend. Her small hand trembled violently as she reached out to touch a faded map spread across an antique wooden table, her fingers tracing the carefully drawn lines that marked distant lands and private estates and locations she had never heard of but instinctively knew were important, dangerous, powerful. Cade turned to face her directly, his expression completely unreadable as always, and he said in a voice that made her skin prickle with fear and anticipation, "Everything you see in this room represents power and influence and secrets that could destroy governments or build empires. And now, whether you're ready or not, you are part of it, connected to it, responsible for it. Ashley swallowed hard, her chest tightening with anxiety, so intense it felt like being crushed, because she had known that being bought meant accepting responsibility, but she had not realized the true depth or magnitude or absolute danger of what she was being drawn into with each passing day. Every choice she made, every action she took, every piece of information she gathered could ripple outward across lives she had never touched and would never meet, affecting people and businesses and entire communities in ways she couldn't predict or control. And now she stood at the very center of something massive and terrifying. Then Cade revealed something that literally stole the breath from her lungs and made her knees go weak. A thick file folder labeled with her own name in bold letters, and inside were photographs of her as a younger child, official letters with government seals, and financial documents detailing not just her tragic past, but connections she had never known existed, hidden allies and dangerous enemies, and opportunities she could use if she was clever and ruthless enough. Ashley's mind reeled as she flipped through page after page, her hands shaking so badly the papers rustled loudly in the silent room. Because how could her life, which had seemed so impossibly small and powerless and meaningless just weeks ago, suddenly be so deeply entangled with people who wielded influence like a deadly weapon? The documents revealed that her parents hadn't simply abandoned her randomly. They had been connected to something larger, something that had gotten them killed, and she was the last living link to secrets that powerful people would murder to protect or expose. Cade watched her reaction with scientific precision, studying every flicker of shock and confusion and dawning horror that crossed her young face, and he finally spoke again with brutal honesty. You need to understand this world faster than you think possible. Absorb information and connections and strategies that would take most people years to master, because ignorance is a luxury you can no longer afford. Not if you want to survive what's coming. Ashley nodded slowly, her hands gripping the edges of the table, so hard her knuckles turned bone white, and she realized the truth in his words with crystalline clarity. Knowledge was power in this hidden world, maybe the only real power that mattered, and she was now being entrusted with secrets that could either protect her like armor or destroy her completely if she mishandled them or revealed them to the wrong people. That night, Ashley lay awake for hours, her exhausted mind refusing to shut down, poring over the documents and tracing connections and memorizing names and faces until they were burned permanently into her memory. The cabin that had once felt like a place of safety and warmth now felt like the command center of a secret war she had been pulled into without her consent. A war fought with information and influence instead of guns and soldiers. Every lesson Cade had taught her, the careful observation, the strategic patience, the unflinching courage, was now being put to the ultimate test, and deep inside her chest, Ashley felt a strange exhilaration mixing with her fear, a dangerous cocktail of emotions that both thrilled and terrified her. She was no longer just a girl in rags rescued from the streets. No longer a victim of circumstance or poverty or cruel fate. She was becoming a player in a world of hidden power and deadly secrets. And for the first time in her short life, she understood that survival would demand more than simple obedience or following instructions. It would demand intelligence and strategy and a level of courage she was only beginning to discover within herself. Courage that would be tested in ways that would either forge her into something extraordinary or break her into pieces too small to ever put back together. Ashley's hands shook uncontrollably as she approached the massive iron gates of the grand estate in the wealthiest district of the city. The envelope from Cade clutched so tightly against her chest that the paper was beginning to crumple and tear at the edges. This was the moment she had been preparing for through weeks of brutal training and impossible tests. The confrontation that could either cement her place in this dangerous world permanently or shatter everything she had worked for into irreparable pieces, and the weight of that reality pressed down on her small shoulders like an invisible mountain. The streets around her were crowded with expensive cars and elegantly dressed people who moved with the confident ease of those who had never known hunger or fear or desperation. And every single passerby seemed like a potential threat, someone who might recognize her as an outsider, someone who didn't belong in this world of marble fountains and manicure gardens and security guards who looked at her with barely concealed suspicion. But fear no longer controlled Ashley the way it once had. She had learned through painful experience to harness it, to sharpen it into awareness, to use it as fuel instead of letting it paralyze her into helplessness. She entered the estate through the massive front doors after convincing the security team she had legitimate business inside, and her small frame went initially unnoticed in the grand entrance hall filled with adults wearing designer suits and discussing deals worth millions of dollars. Then she saw him across the room, Victor Langston, the man whose influence stretched across multiple industries like a spider's web, whose very name carried enough power to make politicians nervous and business leaders scramble for his approval, and whose reputation for ruthlessly destroying anyone who crossed him was legendary even among the wealthy elite. He turned slowly, as if sensing her presence, and his sharp eyes narrowed with a mixture of disbelief and genuine amusement as they fell on this 12-year-old girl standing in his domain without invitation or permission. Ashley's heart pounded against her ribs like a trapped animal desperate to escape, but she remembered every single lesson Cade had drilled into her about observation and precision and projecting subtle authority even when you feel completely powerless. "You're far too young to be here, child," Victor said with a voice that mixed condescension with curiosity, clearly expecting her to stammer or retreat or prove herself unworthy of his valuable time. Ashley held his intimidating gaze with surprising steadiness, refusing to look away or show weakness, and she responded with carefully chosen words that Cade had helped her rehearse, but which now felt completely natural coming from her mouth. "Age does not determine impact or value, Mr. Langston. Only results matter in your world." Then, with deliberate confidence that shocked even herself, she presented the documents she had painstakingly gathered from her missions throughout the city, laying them out on the polished marble table between them like playing cards in a high-stakes game. Every figure she had memorized, every transaction she had uncovered, every hidden alliance she had documented now lay bare before one of the most powerful men in the entire region, and for one terrifying moment Ashley feared she had completely misjudged the situation and made a fatal mistake. But then Victor's expression shifted as he scanned the papers with growing intensity, his eyes widening almost imperceptibly, and a slow smile formed on his face. Not cruel or mocking, but carrying genuine respect mixed with surprise and grudging admiration. "Impressive work," he said quietly, almost to himself, leaning back in his expensive leather chair. "You've uncovered details that most adults wouldn't even attempt to find, information that people with decades of experience have missed completely. You understand things that should be far beyond your years or capabilities." Ashley felt a thrill she could barely contain surging through her entire body, an electric validation that made all the fear and struggle and impossible challenges suddenly feel worth it. For the first time since being bought at that warehouse, she realized with absolute certainty that she had transcended the miserable life she had known before, had evolved beyond being just a silent observer of the world's cruelty and indifference. She was no longer a powerless girl in rags, no longer someone adults could dismiss or ignore or treat as invisible. She had become a genuine force capable of navigating dangerous shadows and commanding real attention from people who controlled entire industries. Returning to Cade later that night, Ashley felt a surge of pride mixed with a new sense of purpose that burned in her chest like a flame that couldn't be extinguished. The confrontation had shocked even the most powerful figures in the city, people who thought they had seen everything, and she knew in her heart that she was no longer just surviving day to day. She was actively shaping her own destiny with every choice and every risk. Subscribe now, because what happens next will force Ashley to face the darkest test yet. And somewhere deep inside her exhausted but exhilarated mind, she sensed that the challenges ahead would push her even further, forcing her to grow faster and think sharper and act braver than she ever thought humanly possible, transforming her into something she couldn't yet fully name but desperately wanted to become. Ashley froze completely, every muscle in her body going rigid with shock, as a man stepped out from the shadows of the narrow alley behind Victor Langston's mansion, his presence so sudden and commanding that it felt like the air itself had changed temperature around her. She had genuinely thought she was alone in this dark passage between buildings, had believed she could slip away unnoticed with the envelope of critical intelligence she had risked absolutely everything to obtain. But here was someone who moved with a confidence and precision that rivaled even Cade's intimidating presence. Her heart exploded into panic mode, pounding so violently she could feel it in her throat, choking off her breath, and her small hands instinctively clutched the envelope against her chest like a shield that could somehow protect her from whatever was about to happen. Every survival instinct that had kept her alive on the streets screamed at her to run immediately, to drop everything and disappear into the maze of alleys and side streets she knew so well. But curiosity and adrenaline surged through her veins in equal measure, rooting her feet to the ground. The man was tall and sharp-eyed with an intensity that seemed to see straight through her carefully constructed defenses, dressed in dark clothes that helped him blend seamlessly into shadows. And he studied Ashley silently for one long, agonizing moment that felt like an eternity compressed into seconds. Then, without any warning whatsoever, he smiled. Not a cruel or mocking smile, but one so genuinely warm and disarming that it made Ashley hesitate in complete confusion and disbelief, because warmth was not something she had learned to trust in this brutal world. "Ashley," he said in a low voice filled with unmistakable intent, using her name like he had every right to know it. "I've been looking for someone exactly like you for a very long time." The words sent an involuntary shiver racing down her spine, and her mind immediately flooded with terrifying questions. How did this stranger know her name? Why had he sought her out specifically in this dangerous place? And was he here to help her or destroy everything she'd built? He explained quickly, speaking in precise and carefully controlled sentences that conveyed both urgency and complete honesty, revealing that he had been tracking her progress for weeks now, watching the way she navigated power and deception and fear with skills that most trained adults would never master. He was an unexpected ally, he claimed, someone with connections she could never hope to reach alone, someone who could help her wield the growing influence she was learning to claim, someone who understood the deadly game she was playing better than almost anyone alive. Ashley studied him with the careful, analytical attention that Cade had drilled into her during countless training sessions, weighing every word against her instincts, searching for subtle cues of deception or hidden motives or unspoken threats in his body language and tone. Everything in her recent brutal education had trained her to recognize danger and manipulation, to trust nothing at face value and question everyone's true intentions. And yet there was something in this man's eyes that made her heart beat with a strange new sensation that felt dangerously close to hope. He reached into his coat slowly, telegraphing his movements so she wouldn't panic, and handed her a small leather notebook filled with contacts and strategies and knowledge she could never have gathered on her own, information that could dramatically accelerate her transformation from street kid to power broker. By the time Ashley returned to the cabin several hours later, her entire world had shifted once again on its axis, tilting in a direction she hadn't anticipated or prepared for. And Cade was waiting with that unflinching, penetrating gaze that missed absolutely nothing. She knew instinctively that introducing a new ally into the delicate and dangerous balance of power could either elevate her to heights she'd never imagined or destroy absolutely everything she had painstakingly built over these intense weeks. But for the first time since being bought, she felt something revolutionary. She wasn't entirely alone anymore in this war. She was learning with startling speed to turn crippling fear into strategic advantage, crushing isolation into valuable collaboration, and paralyzing uncertainty into actionable strength. And deep down in her core, she knew that the next move she made would shock even those powerful people who thought they controlled her fate and understood her limitations. Comment below whether you think this ally can be trusted, because what Ashley discovers about him will blow your mind. And as exhaustion finally pulled her towards sleep that night, one crystallizing truth kept echoing in her mind. She was no longer just reacting to the world around her or surviving whatever tests Cade threw at her. She was beginning to actively shape events, to influence outcomes, to become someone that even dangerous men had to take seriously. And that realization was both the most thrilling and most terrifying thing she had ever experienced. Ashley's hands were slick with nervous sweat as she approached the Grand Hall, where the city's most powerful figures gathered monthly to discuss matters that shaped entire economies. And the envelope from her mysterious new ally felt like it was burning a hole through her coat with the weight of what it contained. Inside were instructions for a meeting that could fundamentally alter everything she had built. An encounter with influential decision-makers who had never taken her seriously until now, people who controlled banks and corporations and political campaigns with casual phone calls. Every step toward those massive oak doors felt like walking a tightrope stretched across a canyon thousands of feet deep, where one tiny misstep could send her plummeting into a fall that would unravel weeks of dangerous preparation, destroy the fragile trust she'd earned, and obliterate the hard-won credibility that had cost her so much pain and fear to build. As she entered the hall with her head held high despite her racing pulse, heads turned immediately and conversations faltered because her age and small frame and presence in such an exclusive place of power should have been laughable, should have gotten her thrown out by security within seconds. But Ashley had learned something crucial from Cade's brutal training. She had discovered how to turn perception itself into devastating leverage, how to use people's assumptions and prejudices against them, how to make her apparent weakness become her greatest strategic advantage. She walked with deliberate confidence that she'd practiced in front of mirrors until it became second nature, her voice steady and clear, her eyes sharp and constantly observing, and every gesture was measured with the precision of someone who understood that power was as much about presentation as it was about actual capability. The first confrontation came swiftly and aggressively when a powerful businessman, known throughout the region for his ruthless tactics, challenged her directly, his voice dripping with sarcasm and barely concealed contempt. "And what exactly makes you think you belong in this room with adults who've spent decades building real influence?" he asked with a smirk that made several people around him chuckle nervously. Ashley's pulse leapt into her throat and her stomach clenched with instant fear, but she didn't falter or retreat or show even a flicker of the doubt that was screaming inside her head. Instead, with a calm that completely belied her 12 years, she laid out facts and observations and strategies that even the most seasoned adults in that room would have struggled to articulate so clearly. She pointed out patterns in their recent business dealings that revealed vulnerabilities they didn't know they had, identified opportunities they had completely missed, and demonstrated an understanding of market dynamics that left several people staring at her in stunned silence. By the time she finished speaking, the businessman's expression had shifted dramatically from amusement to genuine shock to something that looked uncomfortably close to awe or fear. But the real risk, the moment that made her heart nearly stop completely, came when she had to reveal the subtle yet critical secret her ally had given her. Information that could protect Cade's long-term interests while simultaneously exposing a potential threat that several people in this very room had been trying to hide. The moment she spoke those carefully chosen words, a hush fell over the entire hall, like someone had pressed a mute button on reality itself, and eyes widened as whispers began rippling through the crowd like wildfire spreading through dry grass. For one terrible heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, Ashley felt the crushing weight of every possible consequence pressing down on her, threatening to suffocate her with doubt and fear. Yet as she stepped back and surveyed the room, watching the shock register on face after face, the realization hit her with crystalline clarity. She had not only survived this incredibly dangerous encounter, she had actually commanded it, dominated it, controlled it in ways that made grown men and women reconsider everything they thought they knew about power and age and capability. Returning to the cabin that night under a sky full of cold stars, Ashley felt an unfamiliar sensation coursing through her exhausted body. It wasn't just relief or satisfaction. It was something far more profound and intoxicating. It was genuine power, not the reckless or arrogant kind that destroys everything it touches, but the precise, deliberate, earned kind that came from intelligence and courage and an almost supernatural ability to read people and situations. She understood more clearly than ever before that being bought had been only the beginning of her transformation, that survival had evolved into real influence, that paralyzing fear had been forged into strategic brilliance, and that a girl who once wore literal rags had become someone genuinely capable of changing outcomes, challenging the most powerful adults in the city, and shocking even those who thought they controlled her destiny completely. Subscribe because the next challenge will force Ashley to choose between loyalty and survival in ways that will break your heart. And deep down in the most honest part of her soul, she knew with absolute certainty that the next test would demand everything she had learned and more, would push her beyond any limit she thought she had, and would either forge her into something truly extraordinary or shatter her into pieces that could never be reassembled. Ashley's entire world tilted violently sideways the moment she opened the letter that had been left on the cabin table, her small fingers trembling so badly the paper shook like a leaf in a hurricane. And the words written there in that familiar, precise handwriting revealed a truth so profound and devastating that it threatened to crack the very foundation of everything she thought she knew. Someone she had trusted implicitly during these brutal weeks of transformation. Someone whose guidance and training had shaped every step she'd taken into this dangerous new world, had been deliberately concealing a secret so massive that it made all her previous challenges seem like simple practice exercises. Cade stood silently in the corner of the cabin, watching her reaction with those unreadable dark eyes, his expression giving away absolutely nothing as always, and Ashley felt her chest heaving as adrenaline and disbelief collided inside her body in a way that made it genuinely difficult to breathe. She felt the ground beneath her shift, not literally, but emotionally and morally and strategically, as if the entire cabin was tilting and she was sliding toward an abyss she couldn't see. Every lesson he had taught her, every impossible challenge he had thrown at her, every small victory she had earned now carried a shadow she hadn't anticipated or prepared for, and the realization hit her like a physical blow that left her reeling. The person she had relied upon most, the one who had saved her from freezing to death in that train station, had been systematically manipulating circumstances to serve their own hidden agenda all along, and Ashley suddenly understood with horrifying clarity the true depth of the stakes she had been navigating without even knowing the real game being played. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, hot and angry and hurt, but she absolutely refused to let them fall because crying now would be admitting defeat, and she had not survived this much pain and fear just to break down at the moment of truth. Instead, she forced herself to focus, drawing desperately on every ounce of patience and observation and courage that Cade had hammered into her through weeks of relentless training, because she knew instinctively that acting impulsively or emotionally right now could destroy her completely. Her mind raced at lightning speed through strategies and contingencies and possibilities, weighing trust against suspicion with surgical precision, balancing loyalty against pure survival necessity, calculating consequences that reached far beyond her years of experience or understanding. Every decision in this moment had ripple effects she could barely comprehend, implications that could alter not just her future, but the futures of everyone connected to Cade's vast network of power and secrets. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, Ashley straightened her spine with visible effort and gripped the letter so tightly the paper crumpled in her small fist. The betrayal stung like acid in her chest, yes, burned and ached and made her want to scream or run or collapse, but also clarified something absolutely vital that she had been too naive to see before. Power in this world came with inevitable pain. Knowledge always came with dangerous risk, and survival demanded far more than simple courage or intelligence. It demanded strategy, ruthless calculation, and the ability to act decisively and without hesitation when others would freeze or fall apart or give up completely. Ashley was no longer the powerless girl in rags who had stood shivering in that train station, no longer a passive observer of the world's endless cruelty and indifference. She had become an active participant in a game of hidden agendas and shifting loyalties and life-or-death consequences. That night, as the cabin grew deathly quiet except for the crackling fire and the wind howling outside, Ashley sat staring out the frosted window at the cold moonlight reflecting off endless snow. The revelation had shaken her to her very core, had made her question every single thing she thought was true or real or trustworthy, but had also ignited something fierce and unbreakable inside her chest, a fire that refused to be extinguished no matter how much cold reality tried to smother it. She would not be a pawn in someone else's game, would not be deceived or controlled or manipulated without fighting back with everything she had learned and earned. Kate had bought her, yes, had trained her and pushed her and transformed her, but now, armed with this devastating knowledge and a growing sense of her own power, Ashley was ready to navigate a world that had spent her entire life trying to crush people like her into dust. Comment if you think Ashley should confront Cade or keep this secret to herself, because her next move will shock everyone. And somewhere deep in her determined soul, she understood that the person staring back at her from that dark window reflection was someone completely different from the terrified child who had entered this cabin weeks ago. Someone harder, sharper, more dangerous, and absolutely ready to shock everyone who thought she could be controlled or predicted or broken. Ashley's hands felt like ice despite the warm cabin air as she held the sleek black envelope that had arrived without warning, delivered by a courier who disappeared into the forest before she could ask a single question. And Cade's message inside was terrifyingly brief and absolutely direct. A test of loyalty awaited her at the very heart of the city, and failure was simply not an option that existed in his world. Her pulse raced out of control, every nerve firing with electric anxiety, as she realized this challenge would push her far beyond anything she had endured so far. This wasn't about observation or strategy or even courage anymore. This was about proving that she could act decisively and without hesitation even when her heart was screaming at her to stop. She navigated the familiar city streets with a sense of purpose that surprised even herself, moving through the crowds with the confidence of someone who had learned to wear power like a second skin. But underneath that carefully constructed exterior, her mind was churning with doubt and fear and questions about whether she could actually do what Cade was asking. The instructions had been cryptic but devastatingly precise. Meet a specific contact at a predetermined location, retrieve information that could shift the entire balance of power in the region, and deliver it without asking questions or showing mercy or allowing personal feelings to interfere with the mission. Simple words on paper, but the implications were absolutely deadly because one wrong move could expose everything, could get people killed, could destroy the fragile network of alliances that Cade had spent years building. The meeting point was a quiet cafe tucked into a narrow side street that most people walked past without noticing, deceptively ordinary for such a high-stakes encounter that could determine the course of multiple lives. Ashley entered with her heart thundering against her ribs so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it, and immediately hostile eyes turned toward her. This wasn't going to be easy, wasn't going to be safe, and definitely wasn't going to give her any room for mistakes or second chances. A man sat waiting at the far corner table, tall and imposing and radiating authority, even while sitting perfectly still, and he gestured for her to approach with a subtle movement that somehow felt like a command she couldn't refuse. Ashley's pulse thundered in her ears like war drums as she walked across that small cafe, every step feeling like it might be her last. But she kept her voice steady and her expression calm as she exchanged the coded phrases Cade had taught her and retrieved the sealed documents that felt heavier than their actual weight. The man's expression shifted subtly as he studied her with penetrating intensity, absorbing every detail of her body language and tone, and then he did something completely unexpected. He smiled, not with cruelty or mockery, but with genuine surprise and what looked almost like respect. "You're younger than I expected," he said quietly, leaning back in his chair, "but you carry yourself like someone who's seen things most adults never witness in their entire lives, like someone who understands exactly what's at stake here." Ashley realized in that electric moment that she had earned something incredibly rare and valuable. She had gained respect from someone who didn't give it easily, who measured people by their actions rather than their age or appearance or background. She had moved through genuine fear and dangerous deception and crushing uncertainty, navigating them all with a skill that seemed impossible for someone her age, and she had emerged not just intact, but actually victorious in ways that mattered. But the true test came when she returned to Cade hours later, exhausted and emotionally drained, but carrying the critical intelligence he had demanded, because his reaction would determine everything that came next in her rapidly evolving transformation. He studied her in complete silence for what felt like an eternity, his dark eyes scanning her face for any sign of weakness or doubt or betrayal. And Ashley held his gaze without flinching, even though every instinct told her to look away. Then slowly, almost imperceptibly, Cade nodded once with that rare expression that might have been pride or satisfaction or simply acknowledgement that she had passed yet another impossible test. Ashley understood what that silent gesture meant. She had proven herself beyond question, had demonstrated that she was no longer simply the desperate girl who had been bought at a warehouse, but someone capable of navigating the most dangerous aspects of influence and loyalty and strategic action. Subscribe now, because what Ashley faces next will force her to make an impossible choice between saving herself and protecting others. The world she had entered was absolutely unforgiving. Yes, brutal and cold, and filled with people who would destroy her without hesitation if she showed weakness. But she had also proven to herself and to Cade that she could not just survive in that world, but actually thrive within it. Could turn fear into weapon and uncertainty into advantage and youth into unexpected strength that her enemies would never see coming until it was far too late. The sleek black car pulled up silently outside the towering glass building just as dawn broke over the city skyline, painting everything in shades of orange and red that looked almost like blood, and Ashley stepped out onto the cold pavement, knowing with bone-deep certainty that this mission would be different from anything she'd faced before. More dangerous, more complex, more likely to end in disaster if she made even the smallest mistake. The envelope Cade had given her at midnight contained instructions that made her stomach twist into painful knots. Infiltrate a private gathering of the city's most dangerous players, people who didn't just hold power, but wielded it like a weapon to destroy anyone who threatened their interests, extract specific information about an upcoming deal that could shift millions of dollars, and return without leaving any trace or raising even the slightest suspicion. This wasn't a test anymore, wasn't practice or preparation. This was pure survival in its rawest and most terrifying form, and failure would mean consequences far worse than disappointment or punishment. The building she entered was imposing and cold, all glass walls and polished marble that reflected a world she had once only glimpsed from the outside as a starving street kid. And inside, the atmosphere was charged with the kind of tension that comes from too many powerful people occupying the same space while hiding their true intentions behind pleasant smiles. Ashley moved through the crowded lobby with deliberate confidence that she'd perfected over weeks of brutal training. Her small frame working to her advantage because adults consistently underestimated children, consistently dismissed them as harmless or irrelevant or incapable of real threat. She had learned to weaponize that assumption, to use their blindness as her greatest strategic advantage, and tonight she would need every trick she'd mastered. Her first real encounter came fast and without warning when a group of adults, powerful, intimidating, radiating authority like heat from a furnace, surrounded a conference table covered with documents and whispered plans that could affect thousands of lives. Ashley's pulse thudded violently against her chest, threatening to give away her fear, but she reminded herself with fierce internal discipline. Observation comes first. Always watch before you act. Absorb everything and reveal nothing. She approached the group with practiced casualness, her young face showing polite curiosity rather than calculated intent, and she listened with razor-sharp focus as they discussed alliances and betrayals and opportunities, memorizing every detail, every slight hesitation, every vulnerability they accidentally exposed. When a critical opportunity presented itself, a momentary distraction, a careless comment that revealed more than intended, a brief window when documents were left unguarded, Ashley acted with the kind of decisive speed that Cade had drilled into her until it became instinct rather than conscious choice. She collected the key information she needed, the intelligence that could determine whether Cade's entire network survived or collapsed, and she did it so smoothly that not a single person in that room realized they'd been compromised by a 12-year-old girl they'd barely noticed. By the time she exited the building into the cold morning air, the weight of what she had accomplished settled heavily on her shoulders like a physical burden. Because she had taken risks that would make experienced adults hesitate, had faced genuine danger without any backup or protection, and had somehow succeeded against odds that should have crushed her. Returning to Cade hours later with the intelligence safely secured, Ashley handed over the documents with hands that were finally steady, no longer shaking with fear or doubt, and she watched his face for any reaction. He examined everything with methodical precision, his expression unreadable as always, and then for just a moment, barely a flicker, something that might have been. Genuine pride crossed his features before disappearing behind his usual mask of cold calculation. Ashley felt a surge of something powerful and intoxicating flowing through her exhausted body, something she had never really experienced before in her short, brutal life. It wasn't just relief or satisfaction. It was the profound realization that she had genuine mastery over skills that most people would never develop. She understood now, with crystalline clarity, that the girl who had stood barefoot and freezing in that train station was completely gone, transformed into someone capable of navigating shadows and danger and deception with a skill that would shock anyone who knew her story. But deep down in the most honest part of her consciousness, beneath the pride and exhilaration, Ashley also knew that she was approaching something critical. The ultimate test that Cade had been preparing her for all along, the moment that would challenge absolutely everything she had learned and force her to confront truths that could either complete her transformation or shatter her into irreparable pieces. The massive oak door to Cade's private office swung open with a weight that seemed to carry the significance of everything that had led to this single moment. And Ashley stepped inside with her heart hammering so violently against her ribs she thought it might actually break through her chest, knowing instinctively that this was the culmination of every brutal lesson, every impossible test, every terrifying mission that had transformed her from a freezing street child into something she still couldn't fully comprehend. Cade sat behind an imposing mahogany desk that seemed designed to intimidate anyone who approached it, his dark eyes locking onto hers with that familiar intensity that had once paralyzed her with fear, but now felt like a challenge she was finally ready to meet. For weeks, every lesson and challenge had been building toward this exact moment. The final test that wasn't just about obedience or skill, but about defining who Ashley would become, what kind of person she would choose to be when faced with impossible decisions that had no clear right answer. Ashley, Cade said in that measured voice that commanded absolute attention, leaning forward slightly, everything you've accomplished, every risk you've taken, every fear you've conquered has brought you here to this single choice. One decision, one action that will define not just your future, but your fundamental character. So choose wisely because there are no second chances. Ashley swallowed hard, her throat dry as desert sand, and she knew with gut-wrenching certainty that this was no ordinary test designed to measure her skills or loyalty. Inside the folder Cade slid across the polished desk were instructions for a final mission. But unlike every previous challenge, this one came with two completely different paths she could take, and the stakes were higher than anything her 12-year-old mind should have to process. One path guaranteed her safety and wealth and influence beyond anything a kid from District 11 should dare to dream about, offering protection and power in a future where she would never be hungry or cold or powerless again. But it required betraying someone who had risked everything to help her survive, someone who had shown her genuine kindness in a world that had only ever shown her cruelty. The other path demanded courage and selflessness and moral clarity that would cost her dearly, requiring her to reveal a dangerous truth that would protect innocent people, but would simultaneously put her own safety at catastrophic risk and potentially undo everything she had worked so hard to build. Ashley's chest tightened until she could barely draw breath, And for several agonizing moments, she stood frozen between these two impossible choices, her mind racing through every possible consequence and implication while her heart screamed conflicting messages about survival versus integrity. Taking a deep, shuddering breath that seemed to pull air from the very bottom of her soul, Ashley made her choice with trembling hands, but absolute conviction. She chose the path that would protect the innocent, that would expose the hidden threat even though it meant sacrificing her own security, that honored the suffering girl she used to be rather than erasing her completely in pursuit of power. With steady determination that surprised even herself, she delivered the truth to Cade, revealing the conspiracy she'd uncovered and the people who needed protection. And she watched his eyes widen with genuine shock, because he had clearly expected her to choose safety over morality. Then slowly, almost reverently, Cade stood from behind his desk, and for the first time since buying her at that warehouse, he smiled, not with calculation or coldness, but with something that looked remarkably like genuine respect mixed with wonder. "You've grown far beyond what I imagined possible," he said quietly, his voice carrying an emotion Ashley had never heard from him before, far beyond what anyone who knew where you came from could have predicted or believed. In that electric moment of recognition, Ashley understood the ultimate truth that had been hidden beneath every test and challenge. Cade had not been training her to become his obedient tool or loyal servant. He had been preparing her to become something far more valuable and dangerous, someone capable of making moral choices under crushing pressure, someone who could wield power without being corrupted by it, someone who would choose integrity even when it cost everything. She was no longer just a girl in rags rescued from freezing streets, no longer a victim of circumstance or a pawn in someone else's game. She had become a genuine force in the world, brave and intelligent and unshakably principled. And the shock wasn't in what Cade had done by buying her, but in what she had done to herself by choosing morality over comfort, courage over fear, and humanity over power at every critical moment. Subscribe and comment below with what you think happens to Ashley next, because her story is just beginning and the world has no idea what's coming. As Ashley walked out of that office into the bright morning sunlight, she realized that the true twist in her story wasn't about being bought or trained or tested. It was about discovering that she possessed something far more valuable than any skill or knowledge Cade could teach her, something that had been inside her all along waiting to be forged in the fire of impossible choices. An unbreakable core of moral strength that would guide her through whatever darkness lay ahead, and that strength would shock everyone who thought they understood what it meant to have real power. If you made it here, then you're destined for this. Hit the subscribe button so the algorithm will keep showing interesting stories like this. Thanks for watching.